Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to your weekly dose of the occult and the macabre. This is the Dark Hour Podcast, and I'm your host, KDG, self appointed collector of horrendous abominations. Before we start, I'd like to point out that this podcast is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to any existing person, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The aim of this podcast is to entertain and nothing else. So let's get back to it. Have you ever watched a horror movie and found a character who seems like he knows the lore of what's happening? The man in the van who does the research, tells the main peeps what they need to do? Well, over the years, people around me have constantly told me that I was that guy. Fortunately, we don't live in a horror movie, but all the same, I'd like to help my listeners out just in case they do manage to encounter the unexplained. For tonight's episode, we'll be discussing the basics of the Aswang. Tonight, I'll be talking about what an Aswang is, its powers and abilities, its weaknesses, and how it's portrayed in pop culture. By the end of this episode, hopefully you'll have a better idea on how to deal with one if you're unlucky enough to find it. So sit back, relax, and allow me to offer you some advice if you're completely sure that what you're dealing with is actually an Aswang. What exactly is an Aswang? An Aswang is a shape-shifting monster that feeds on the entrails of human beings. It has many kinds and variations, but we'll primarily focus on what I'd like to call the basic Aswang. The vanilla flavor, if you will. While I say that they feed primarily on entrails, they are most notably known to prey on children. They're often seen as an old lady which usually lives alone. They keep a very low profile to avoid suspicion, but they generally act normally towards people. They're usually associated with vampires as they share the same abilities, but this is actually a misconception. While they do have the enhanced strength, shape-shifting abilities, and the like, they are vastly different in several ways. Aswangs don't usually die in the sunlight. They are in fact weaker while under the sun, but it can't harm them directly while in their human form. Since they're shapeshifters, they can take many different forms, which can be a black dog called a sigbin, a gigantic bird called a wakwak, or a giant black boar. The boar doesn't have a cool name though. In any case, they also have their humanoid form with sharpened claws and teeth. They use this to hunt people who stay outside late at night, or children sleeping in their beds. They also have a specialized tongue that can pierce roofs. These Aswangs specifically target the unborn baby still fresh in the womb. Though there are many kinds of Aswang, they all have the same modus operandi. The objective is to kill their victim and eat their insides, retreating to their house before the sun is up. Famous stories mostly come from the Visayas region in the Philippines. None, however, have been more popular than the story of Teniente Gimo. He has become infamous over the years, mostly due to the many stories that pop up during Halloween. Having been the stuff of legends, his story is what we'll be basing off our lore. The story of Teniente Gimo, or Lieutenant Gimo, is based off an urban legend coming from Iloilo, a province in the Visayas region. It was said that he and his clan of Aswang are located specifically at Dueñas, Iloilo. According to the stories, his clan was famous for hosting festivals in their town. The lieutenant's daughter, let's call her Gina, was studying in Manila and invited her friend, Karen. When they got there, Karen noticed how Gina's family lived in the town deep within the forest. While they were waiting to get picked up, Karen noticed that the locals were giving them weird looks. When she asked, Gina just shrugged it off, saying that the locals didn't like their family because they were rich. Believable? Karen was really bothered about how people kept looking at them, but she figured that's just how small towns worked. They were picked up eventually by Gina's relatives, and they entered the village. As they entered, they were showered by the hospitality of the Gemok clan. Everything was set up for the fiesta, with a gigantic roast in the middle of the small village. Gina explained that this is where they'll have their special feast tonight. For the time being, they were asked to stay in their own little nipa house. Despite their lodging and the hospitality that they got, Karen couldn't shake the bad feeling they had before they got picked up. That little bit of paranoia would eventually save her life. Later into the night, an older lady came into the house and offered Karen some tea to help her relax a little bit more. Karen sat on her bed near the window while Gina laid down napping on hers near the door. The old lady insisted that she should drink the tea while it was still hot. Kind of weird, very pushy, but Karen nodded politely and the old lady went out. Karen really didn't feel like drinking tea, so she woke Gina up and offered her the tea. Gina, still a bit groggy, took 2 gulps and then just slumped over on Karen's bed. She was out like a light. The power suddenly goes out and Karen panics. She puts a blanket on Gina, covering her up. Karen jumps on the bed near the door and covered up as well. Not a few seconds later, she heard multiple people entering the nipa hut. She kept her head down but peeked under the cover of the blanket. The old relative that gave them the tea came back in after the multiple people and pointed at Gina, who was on Karen's bed. She heard her whisper, "That's her," and just hit her on the head to make sure. The man next to her raised what appears to be a stick, and Karen heard a sickening crack as the stick made contact with Gina's head. They wrapped and tied up the ends of the blanket, keeping Gina nice and bundled all inside. As they exit the nipa house, Karen waited for a few minutes before running out. As she was finding her way out, she saw that the people outside looked like they were preparing for the feast. The men from the nipa hut put down Gina in the middle of it all, suspended above the fire in that gigantic pit that they saw while they were coming in, cooking the poor girl. She could only steel herself as she snuck away to a path leading to the outskirts of the village. As she was making her way out, she heard a blood-curdling scream of the townspeople as they realized that they had gotten the wrong girl. Karen kept on running, never looking back. The Nyantakimo's story was so popular, in fact, that Shake, Rattle, and Roll 2, a horror anthology movie released in the 90s, featured a story called Aswang that was loosely based on this urban legend. Now, decades later, the lieutenant and his clan of Aswang still inhabit our worst nightmares. Well, at least mine. Hopefully, though, we can get another adaptation of this famous story, now with, better equipment to record with. So, now that you have an idea on what an Aswang does, or what an Aswang be, it's time to talk about how you deal with them. The basic Aswang is weak in the sunlight. This would be a time where it would be hiding either in its lair or in plain sight. Like mentioned before, an Aswang would generally be normal enough to blend in with society. Some say that they can even go out to mass, but they leave just before the consecration of the body of Christ. The more traditional stories, however, tell that they can't even enter any sacred ground, meaning a church, a chapel, or any place blessed by a priest. So if you're living in one of these, well, you're a lucky boy. All that said, it just tells you that they're harder to spot in a crowd. To that I say, well, yeah, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any signs. One of the most blatant way to tell if a person is an Aswang or not is if that person doesn't have a philtrum. If you don't know what that is, that's the little ridge at the base of your nose that runs down to your upper lip. But of course, not having a philtrum doesn't automatically make you an Aswang, so don't go just checking people for their philtrums and declaring that they're Aswang if you don't find one. Another sign of an Aswang is when you look into a person's eyes and see that your reflection in their eyes is actually upside down. Now again, this doesn't give you the free rein to just look deeply into a person's eyes to see if they're an Aswang. Because chances are, if you do get to that point, you're already lying down face up on the ground as the thing tears your insides apart. If you want, there's a special oil called hintura, which bubbles up whenever a supposed aswang is near. It might be hard to find, but consult your local albularyo if you have one. That's local magic man to the international friends. There are also special talismans made to repel the aswang, like prayer beads or a special red and black bracelet usually given to babies. In the province, locals also make use of a buntot pagi, or a whip made out of a stingray's tail. It is said to leave a deep gash if ever an aswang gets struck by one. But then again, I guess so does everyone. Don't get struck by buntot pagi, guys. I don't think you'll get out of that unscathed, aswang or not. But if you ask your local albularyo and he says he's fresh out, there are common household items that are actually aswang deterrents. Aswangs have notoriously strong senses of smell, which makes them vulnerable to certain scents. It is said that garlic, salt, vinegar, or even the smell of a lemon can repel one. You know what, on that note, aswangs must really hate adobo. If you have any kind of bronze though, that can be poisonous to an aswang as well. But KDG, I hear you ask, what if I'm outside? Well, in the province, it's widely believed that if you're outside, you should wear black. They say that if an aswang sees this, they'll think you're an aswang too. I wish I was kidding. They also say that if someone is staring daggers at you during the night while you're walking around, an aswang has glowing red eyes during the night. As a general rule, I say just keep away from people who have glowing red eyes just in case. On a more serious note though, if there is a supposed aswang in your area, your best bet would just be to hunker down in your own home and just be extra careful when you're out at night. Maybe stop going to the local store just to buy chips in the middle of the night. Don't go looking for aswang because they're natural-born hunters and, for them, you're just prey. Like I mentioned before, aswangs are generally just normal people until they actually hunt and kill people. If you live in the middle of a city, I mean, really, how many aswang reports have you heard recently? You're probably safe. However, if you do find yourself in a situation like this in the future, your best bet is to identify who the aswang is, avoid them, and have your house blessed by a priest ASAP. Cook plenty of adobo, make sure to use a lot of garlic, and make sure to be extra kind to your neighbors as well. Chances are, if you do all of these things, an aswang would probably leave you alone. You're too much trouble to eat anyway. Congratulations, you just survived your horror movie scenario. And that is going to be it for my personal tips on how to deal with an aswang. I hope you guys are staying safe out there. I'll be doing a lot more of these tips in the next few episodes, and like this one, they'll be up every Sunday at around 7 p.m, so stay tuned. If you like content like this and you want to see more, you can check out the previous episodes of the Dark Hour podcast here on my channel. I made a playlist for it, so it's a little bit easier for everyone to see. I am your host, KDG, and this has been the Dark Hour podcast. Good fright and good night.